Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the Executive Director of the Democracy Program here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are pleased to bring you this event on artificial intelligence and the 2024 election in partnership with Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. BPC believes that working together, we can forge durable, bipartisan solutions that benefit America and Americans. One of our institutional goals is strengthening our democracy and its institutions, which is why we have devoted much of the past 10 years to election and voting policy. Every election cycle comes with its own unique developments, and 2024 is no exception. The widespread and growing accessibility of generative artificial intelligence is already shaping campaigns and voting. In January, for example, we saw deepfake robocalls purporting to be from President Biden sent to New Hampshire voters with a message discouraging them from voting. Public discourse and media coverage have understandably focused on the potential threats and challenges for democracy. Foreign and domestic actors have much easier access to tools that can create convincing deepfakes and amplify misinformation about how and when to vote, to depict candidates in false, embarrassing, and compromising situations, and to fuel conspiracies about voting irregularities, just to name a few. While that's sensational, we cannot discount the potential benefits of AI for elections and democracy either. Technology has for decades fueled innovation in campaigns and increased access to information about voting, campaigns, and candidates. The challenge and promise of generative AI in elections lands at a time of heightened tensions and sharp debates about election integrity and voter access. It poses real challenges for election administrators who for decades have been underfunded and unfortunately in recent years under threat. So that's the issue. But I think you're here to learn about solutions. So I'd like to welcome today's panel and to introduce our moderator, Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. Ethan is the Dean and Sidney Stein Professor at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He recently co-authored a white paper, Preparing for Generative AI in the 2024 Election, Recommendations and Best Practices Based on Academic Research. Ethan, welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for having us. We're really delighted to be here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And for the Harris School, I guess we pride ourselves being outside of DC, that we can take the time and space to be analytic and evidence-based about policy issues. But we really value the opportunity to engage with people who are working very deeply on trying to actually affect policy change and have some exchange back and forth between the academy and people doing the hard work of policy. And it's just a delight to get to be here. So I'm really happy to be doing this event and to be joined by three amazing panelists. So let me quickly introduce them before we get into our conversation. Right here to my left, Will Adler is the Associate Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Before joining BPC, he led the election policy work at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He's also worked on technology issues for Senator Elizabeth Warren and had done some research on related issues at a university in New Jersey whose name we won't mention. But with itself a fine policy school as well. Delightful to have him. We're not setting the order on my page. Megan Chahi is the Director of Technology Policy at American Progress. She has extensive experience across the U.S. public and private sectors and has spent the majority of her career promoting transparency and accountability inside social media companies. Prior to joining American Progress, she worked at Meta, Instagram, and Twitter, where she worked on issues of user choice and control, wrote substantial platform policies, and generally worked on safeguarding democracy in social media. Prior to that, she also served in the U.S. Department of the Treasury, in the Office of International Affairs and the Office of Domestic Finance. It's great to have you here. Thanks. And finally, Neil Chilson is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Growth and Opportunity. He's a lawyer, a computer scientist. He's the author of the book, Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. Prior to his current position, he was the Senior Research Fellow for Technology and Innovation at Stand Together, where he guided efforts to understand and promote the legal and cultural paradigms that best enable people to discover, innovate, and improve lives and society. He's an attorney, and he's worked as an attorney at the FTC as well as elsewhere in the government. So great to have you.
Great to be here.
We're going to jump right into talking about AI and elections. There's a lot to talk about. We're going to try and talk about some of the problems. We're going to try and talk about some of the solutions, such as they are. and what we should all be expecting in the run-up to the 24 election. I think it's worth noting as we start doing so that, of course, we're going to face a very important U.S. election this year, and that AI is a major policy issue in the U.S. election this year. We are not the only country on the earth having elections this year. Something like 4 billion people are going to have the opportunity to vote in democratic or quasi-democratic elections this year, and many of them are going to face related threats, and many of those countries face related policy issues. So we're really grappling with a set of global issues that the whole world is facing. So let's start with AI and election risks. I'm interested in just hearing from you all about how you think about what the sort of set of risks we're facing are. I think there's a bunch of sort of topics inside that get lumped into discussions of AI and elections, which include things like deepfakes and October surprises, which include things like threats to election administration, which include things like misinformation about elections coming through various kinds of AI interfaces. They also include things like cybersecurity and the like. And so I'm interested in sort of unpacking that a little bit and just hearing from each of you about how you think about what really are the sort of first order threats we should be thinking about. And then we'll turn a little bit to some of the solutions and to what regulation might look like. So Will, you want to get us started?
Sure, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned trying to restrict this to first order impacts of AI, because we can get into a whole thing about first order versus second order. But there's so much to talk about, so many different ways to organize this discussion. One way that I like to think about is, who's using the AI, right? So you can think about the kind of risks that Matt brought up in his introductory remarks, right? Like the Biden deepfake, other kinds of content produced by actors who are seeking to deceive voters, right? Malicious actors, foreign or domestic. That's a whole huge set of risks that we could spend the entire hour discussing, and there's reasons to be really concerned about that stuff, and also reasons to think that we as Americans are sort of resilient to this stuff, or that this doesn't change the picture with disinformation all that much. So that's one group of people, malicious actors. A second group is average voters trying to use AI to get information about how to vote. This is something that you mentioned. This is something that people have some concerns about. I think there's good reason to think that this is not a huge risk. One is that it doesn't seem like voters are interested in receiving information about how to vote or about candidates through AI or through chatbots. We did a report a couple weeks ago on where voters get this kind of information about elections, and getting information from chatbots ranked very low. I think it was almost last, like below, I don't know where I get my information. So it doesn't seem like this is something that voters are interested in for now. But the one thing about that is the AI chatbots are popping up. They're sort of becoming inescapable, right? On Instagram, if you use the search bar, you now sometimes get forced into a chat with the Meta chatbot. So they are just becoming more integrated into the products that voters use. Another reason not to be so concerned about that is that the tech companies are aware that these chatbots can be misleading, can hallucinate, and they try to do things to kind of redirect voters towards authoritative sources and things like that. So there are reasons to be concerned, but also reasons to think it's not going to be so bad.
All right, well, thank you to BPC and Harris for having me. My take on this is that, as with any other technology, AI makes good things better and bad things worse. And so as I think about the existing ecosystem around elections and the way we kind of consume and receive and generate information, it's already pretty fragile. It's definitely weaker at this point than in most of recent history. And so with the advent of generative AI and these tools, I see that problem as exacerbated. I don't think AI is really going to be the reason democracy ends or falls apart. I think that has its own other issues. But the reality is it drops the barriers to creating and disseminating information that is problematic in nature about anything, but especially about elections in such a fragile, weak time for our democracy. And the dissemination of information really falls to the platforms. People are not sharing on OpenAI the way they are on Instagram or on Snapchat or other places. And so the existing problems around mis and disinformation and authoritative sources and really having clear election policies and election protocols in place very much is more pertinent than ever. And that's regardless of generative AI or not, but heightened because of generative AI. The only kind of caveat I will say there is that the thing that keeps me up at night with AI in elections is not a deep fake of Joe Biden or of Donald Trump the week of the election. It's actually like the down ballot considerations in such a massive election with all 50 states heading to the polls at the local, state, and federal levels. There are so many microcosms of risk that exist where the digital literacy around spotting and reporting on a deep fake of Joe Biden is far less than it will be, far more than it will be for something like a school board election the night before the election. And so it's really incumbent on those stakeholders, the local election authorities, the state authorities, to build that literacy, to do that debunking, and to not rely on the platforms, because while I am, a former employee of them and I worked on things like authoritative sources, I also know that is barely scratching the surface of the problem. And so it is incumbent on all the players and not just relying on platforms for self-regulation for this problem.
So maybe I'll start with something that, at least from the people I'm talking to, is not a risk. One of the early discussions was that cybersecurity would be a big challenge in AI. AI lets you build code. It lets people who are not deeply sophisticated build code often. And I think there was a lot of early talk about whether or not this would present a cybersecurity risk to the election infrastructure. From my discussions with cybersecurity experts, they're not that worried about that. It turns out the US has a very robust, redundant, almost so distributed that it's almost chaotic election system that is very hard to capture in a way that you can manipulate the votes using even a bunch of vulnerabilities. So that doesn't seem to be the concern that it was maybe initially. There might be other types of cybersecurity threat that are real with AI, but it doesn't seem like our election infrastructure is at particular risk here because of these new generative tools. The biggest risk that I see is still, while we have the cybersecurity thing, it seems like kind of locked down, we still don't trust each other very much. And I do think that the concerns around misinformation are where most people are now focused. One of the things that I worry about in this space is that we're changing the outcome of an election quite difficult by manipulating what people see, especially at the national level. Some of the more local ones where you have a very small number of votes, that might be another thing. But at the national level, that's quite hard to do. If it was possible to do, the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that go into getting voters to change their minds would be much more predictable, right? And so we don't really know how to do that well. But one thing that is easier to do is to make people less certain about the validity of the outcome. And so we are already in a place mentioned previously where the American public is worried anytime an election happened about whether or not their guy got a fair shake. And a lot of the discussion around AI, while maybe not actually contributing to that, gives another narrative that somebody can grab onto and say, like, this is another reason why my guy didn't get a fair shake. And so I think that it's really up to us to figure out ways to educate the public reporters' coverage of this issue so that they talk about these issues in a way that is balanced and addresses concerns that people might have, but doesn't hype the concerns so that people just automatically turn to AI as a reason that the election didn't go well if it didn't go the way that they wanted, on November 5th. So that's where I am most worried, is the after effects of how people might perceive the impact of AI on the election, whether or not AI actually changed a single person's vote.
Let me follow up on that point a little bit, because I think this question about, I think if you think about 2020, one of the sort of positive stories of 2020 for American democracy is the extent to which the professionalism of election administration really held up despite pretty concerted attacks on it, and that we saw secretaries of state, county election administrators really behaving in extremely professional, technocratic manner, even facing a lot of difficulty. And so I think that's really sort of a story of a triumph of American democracy, election administration. And I think it's worth thinking about, is 2024, is that the natural sort of attack surface now? And should we be worried about AI and that? So I want to just give you a few scenarios and think about it. So the one you pointed to, I guess, is the kind of, it's almost the liar's dividend story. It's like the election doesn't go the way you want, and then there's this narrative that gets spun up. Oh, it was AI-based micro-targeting, or it was AI-based image, and that we undermine faith in elections through blaming AI for an outcome we didn't like, even if that's not true. Another kind of scenario along these lines would be if you think about from 2020 things like the famous video of a poll worker innocently moving some ballots from here to there. That became in Arizona, that became a very big story. You can imagine a deep fake version of that looks less innocent, is harder to refute, whatever, and that you really get the use of AI for an attack, trying to undermine faith in election administration. You could imagine other kinds of scenarios along that line. You could imagine a deep fake video that called for a march on election administration, or said that there's counter protesters somewhere and you should show up, by some prominent person that wasn't real. Is the set of attacks on election administration broad enough that we should be thinking about policy responses or education responses now? And what are the set of concerns about not the red versus blue use of AI, but the attack on the institution's use of AI that should be most concerning to us?
So my first question is, what is the marginal add that generative AI brings to this, right? As you pointed out, it didn't take a very detailed photo to stir up a giant controversy. And so our attackers, are they going to spend a bunch of time figuring out an AI tool to do this? Or are they going to just take a blurry photo and spend all of their time and money in distributing that rumor rather than in generating the content? And so I don't think we know exactly how that shakes out, but my intuition is that it still really is distribution that matters. The choke point for misinformation is not really the generation of it, it's the distribution of it. And so I think that's where people will still spend a lot of time. Hopefully that's where the platforms are spending a lot of time as well. And maybe it adds a little bit, but we should think about what is the margin there before we decide to plunge in and do something that's very specific to AI, rather than say more general about deceptive attempts to intimidate voters or direct them somewhere else or threaten election officials, regardless of what technology you're using. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I mostly agree with that too. I think like all of the examples that you cited that could be deep fakes, there's low-tech equivalents of them that seem like they would be just as effective and that election officials have seen in the past. And I sort of agree that it doesn't change the picture that much necessarily, and it's going to require election officials to double down on all of the stuff that they've been learning how to do since 2016, since 2020. They've had so much more put on their plate in terms of comms responsibilities, getting to know who their local reporters are, learning how to, being prepared to counter some kind of false narrative that might come up, whether or not it's AI generated or whether it's just some photo that's stripped of context and put, with some other description or something like that. So I think a lot of the solutions are things that election officials have been practicing for a while and getting good at. It's hard to say what kind of narratives they're going to face this year, though.
I think the problem of scale is really relevant here, because the platforms have been dealing with the mis and disinfo challenges. Like I said, it's an existing problem. When you have a Sora or a DALL-E or any of these sort of video or photo creation tools, there will be more of this content out there. And so in a situation where the status quo is already that they can't tackle this problem head on with enough sort of resources to do it fully, and you add additional tools to create and generate this imagery with a dissemination problem, who's to say what the reality will look like come election time? It could be awful. It could also just be a drop in the bucket of an existing set of issues.
I think that also gets to your point about the effect on lower profile elections or like smaller jurisdictions. I think when we talk about a Biden deepfake, Obviously, that would be debunked, reported pretty widely, and hopefully that would make it to voters. I think we assume
Yeah.
maybe incorrectly that debunking would make its way to voters. But at the lower level, where like there's maybe not a local newspaper that can is actually able to pick up some narrative and figure out how to report on it, I do agree with you that that's going to be something more to watch.
And in time, right, to reach
Yeah.
voters when they're voting by mail, maybe
Right.
weeks or months in advance of the election, or heading to the polls the day of. It's going to be challenging.
So I think it's worth it's interesting to think about if we start turning our attention to thinking about regulation and regulatory responses or self-regulation. As we think about this, to what extent is this just politics as usual? And yeah, there's some new tools, but there's been dirty politics since time immemorial. We've had the last decade of social media and content moderation wars, and it's more of the same. Another possibility is the scale really matters, and that maybe it shifts strategies a bit. So as opposed to this, what we've been sort of focused on about micro-targeting and manipulation, maybe it enables kind of flood the zone kind of strategies more than in the past because it's so easy to generate so much content. I don't know. As we think about the set of problems, do we have a set of working regulatory or policy ideas that feel up to the moment at all? What do they look like? Where are we seeing them? We've seen a bunch of states attempt to do some regulation. We are having some conversations, at least in Congress, about regulation. Where's the regulatory conversation or the policy conversation making the most progress?
Well, I might just add another thing that we need to think about, which is the parties involved, and I'll put on my public choice hat for a second. Incumbents traditionally have been, they always worry about new technologies, right? Because especially new technologies that push capabilities that help people at a lower scale be able to produce content at a more professional level. And so I think that can help explain some of the concern that we hear from elected officials around generative AI, is that it's the type of tool that they have been spending tons of money to create content that looks like that. And now somebody else, a competitor, can create sophisticated content for a low cost. And so I do think we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the policy choices we make. Big picture, regulation around speech about elections runs right into the First Amendment. And so you always have to keep that in mind as well. And that's why I think a lot of the best, most targeted tools in this space are going to be focused on the types of things that are conduct aimed at the electoral process and not aimed at the discussion around the election. So when you're doing things like lying to people about where their polling place is, or threatening or harassing election officials, maybe in an automated way. Those are types of things that I think we can have and we should have good solutions for. I don't know that they need to be AI specific. I think those types of things we have laws around much of that. Maybe we need to strengthen those laws, but I don't know that they need to be AI specific to also address any challenges that AI might bring to that space.
Yeah, so I would sort of take a big picture approach here and say there is a dearth of tech regulation, with the exception of the news today around TikTok. That's maybe the first piece of tech regulation in over a decade. And I am of the belief that, it is a failure of this administration if that's the only thing that they're regulating, a singular platform. There is a strong need for a federal data privacy law. There is a strong need for protecting kids online. You can argue how to go about those things, but my general thought and that of kind of the folks in the space is that there is a need for regulation in the online ecosystem. We see it with the FDA, we see it with the CFPB, and we've also seen a failure on the platforms to self-regulate effectively. And so with all of that, notwithstanding generative AI, it's clear there's a need kind of for more in DC and at the states. And in the absence of regulation in DC, the states have actually stepped up in a lot of ways. You have CCPA in California, which has really raised the foundation for how most tech companies build privacy into their systems. Similar with GDPR, it's sort of baked into a lot of what they're doing now. But even with generative AI in Michigan, the governor there passed a law around disclosure of generative AI in ads 90 days ahead of the election. And so, you can see states starting to create bespoke approaches for themselves that they think get at this problem. And some have pros, some have cons. There are, of course, trade-offs to regulation, but I think given all of that and the moment that we're kind of in now, there is a strong need for for baseline regulations in DC around tech, but especially for ensuring that we can harness all the opportunities of AI with balancing the risks. But the caveat I will say there is, as Neil said, there is a lot already out there that doesn't not apply to AI. And really excited that we're undertaking a body of work around existing authorities to say how does AI apply for the Department of Education or for HHS and other organizations. And so I think that's a really good starting place in absence of a solid AI bill or even any sort of tech bill that isn't targeted at a single platform, which is what we have right now.
Yeah, taking an approach that is about the harms and the risks that we're actually worried about rather than the technology itself seems like the right approach. And we already do have so many tools in the toolbox, like you guys were referring to, right? In lots of states, speech that's deceiving voters about the time, place, and manner of elections is already illegal, whether you use generative AI or whether you use CRAN. So some of the things that the states are doing is pretty interesting, particularly around transparency, right? So the states like Michigan have passed laws that the lawmakers have to figure out what does it mean for something to be produced by generative AI or substantively generated by AI, and require some kind of disclaimer, just like you see on any other political ad about who paid for the ad. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see if that works, see if there are ads that do use generative AI and go with the label, or whether the labeling kind of like raises the cost of doing it and dissuades campaigns from doing it. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
One thing I'll add on that is many of the statutes, I know at the federal level, and I looked at the Michigan bill briefly, they have a challenge, a definitional challenge, like we all do, around what is AI and what fits under the bill. And so if I was advising a candidate, it would be hard for me to say, don't put this disclaimer on your content, because I think it would be pretty hard right now to produce a video that didn't use some sort of machine learning algorithm, even down to the cameras. I mean, the chips in cameras now essentially have embedded machine learning algorithms that sharpen the photo. And so does that count as AI? Is that deep? And I don't know if you guys saw like that video that with Apple's new the iPhone 15, where the bride had like an arm in the wrong place, or had 3 arms, and that was because of the generative algorithm that's built into the phone as it takes a picture. And so would that count as generative AI? And would you have to put this disclaimer, or else you face, in some states, potential criminal penalties? I think that the safe bet would be to just put that disclaimer everywhere, which means it's not useful because it's on every ad. And so I think there are some practical challenges here. They're very hard to nail down. And that's why I think a text-specific approach is probably not the right approach. We should focus on the conduct that we're worried about.
If I think about the story you told, Neil, about why incumbents might oppose a new technology, that an entrenched incumbent, any change creates risk. You were going to win as things were, so why change anything? Because you're winning. I take to be your story, which is a story I like. And I want to think about positive potential use cases or effects of generative AI in the election space. One thing I might think is the story you told about why they oppose regulation is really actually a good story for electoral democracy, especially for down ticket races, for low-funded candidates, for challengers to entrenched incumbents who can now generate professional-looking campaign copy. They can generate ads almost for free. And in fact, if you look at say the data from the last couple elections on who was using, for example, Facebook ads for political targeted ads, they're massively taken up by challengers and by down ticket underfunded candidates. So Is this a good story for AI in elections? Are we headed towards a golden age of electoral competition because AI makes it possible to run against entrenched incumbents? Are there other positive stories about AI in the election space that we should be not just all doom and gloom, but good things for elections coming out of this?
I mean, good or bad? Maybe I'll say maybe the incumbents are good, right? Like there are some technologies that empower. They can make the world more complicated, right? Like when you look at the use of social media, the story in politics, the story for the President Obama election was very positive, and the story about how Trump used it was quite negative. And I think you can really, I think what you'll see is a lot more variability in the ability of candidates to get traction who don't have traditional backgrounds. And so I think that that can be a good story for democracy. That can be a challenging story for democracy. It just really depends in part on the candidates. I trust the American people enough to think that we'll figure this sort of thing out. We have a system in place that's not purely, maximum votes get you across the line. And so it does still take a lot of scale. It takes an ability to build a coalition. And I think some of that protects us from the most extreme types of variants. And AI doesn't really change that too much. I think there are other positive stories around the use of powerful communications tools, but I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to stop.
I mean, when I think about the upsides here, I think about election officials as just part of the workforce, part of the civic workforce that's being asked to do a lot with not very much funding, right? Elections are carried out in the US by about, depending on how you count, by about 10,000 different jurisdictions. Many of those jurisdictions, the elections are carried out by just one person who's maybe part-time. Maybe they have one IT staffer or 0 IT staffers, depending on the size. They have a lot to do, and I think of the opportunities there that AI could offer them in terms of being able to do more with less, which we're always asking them to do. Although what we should actually do is fund them at higher levels. And there are things that election officials have to do that can be streamlined by use of AI, right? They also have to generate a lot of copy, a lot of memos and things, just like any campaign would. They have materials that need proofing and things like that. There's kind of a set of activities that they can do that AI could potentially really help with, and some election officials are sort of experimenting with it, in these kinds of areas, but there's not any it's early days. There's not any official guidance from anybody on how to do this kind of thing safely and responsibly. And I think we'll get there eventually. I think eventually it'll be incorporated into election officials' workflows, just like it's going to be for all sorts of workers. I'm actually just curious. Raise your hand if you've tried using generative AI to do something related to your job. Okay, I think it's a little over half, and I think this goes for most different offices, and that includes election officials. So we just have to figure out how it can help and how to put safeguards on it. And with elections, a lot of that involves making sure that no matter what you do, there's always human review at the end of the process, and human review is just built into the DNA of election officials. It's just a part of the process.
I would add another positive here, which is the flip side of the coin that I kind of spoke about earlier around the ease and the reduction of a hurdle to create mis and disinformation and sort of video and text and audio, which is civic participation becomes quite a bit easier for people who want to write a letter to their congressperson or want to engage on an issue and aren't really sure how or need a head start. You probably, those of you that raise your hand have probably used ChatGPT or whatever it is to get started on something, right? You have an idea and you put an outline in there or whatever it is. You want to go to Prague and you're not sure what to do, so you ask it and it gives you information. It fleshes out that idea into something more. And you can think about that in the civic context, which is, I care about this issue and I want to write to my congressperson or my mayor or whoever it is, but I don't know how to do that. And that's a very clear-cut example of a real positive in the civic election democracy space that obviously carries all of the risks that I spoke about earlier, but is a real opportunity as well.
Maybe you can help us think a little bit about the self-regulation side. So let's think a little bit about, we've seen a variety of tech companies take a variety of different approaches to these issues over the last decade or so. I'm interested both in what you, I mean, in this election, we're seeing Twitter really go in kind of the opposite direction from where everybody else has gone over the last decade, and that's interesting to think about, I think. So I'm interested in just your take on what kinds of self-regulatory strategies have been tried in earnest, and did they do anything?
Great question. So, in my time at Meta and Twitter, and I will say I was fired the first day Elon took over the company. So with that big asterisk that I was not there for the Elon era. Yeah, it's a proud badge I wear every day, especially here in DC. So I was on a team that was called Product Trust or Product Policy, however you want to call it, and essentially I advocated for all of the things we're talking about here, like content moderation and safety and transparency and accountability, in rooms full of people building the stuff. So data scientists, engineers, product managers, designers. And I was often the only person in a room full of these people advocating for the issues that I really cared about, vis-a-vis things like growth and engagement and time spent and stock price and the bottom line and all of the things that for-profit institutions naturally care about. And without a sort of external push to really prioritize these things, ultimately these incentives were never really prioritized by the companies because they didn't have to be. And to this day, without appropriate external pressure or regulation or some kind of forcing function, I don't believe that they will be. And that's partly why I made the transition and I left the tech world to come to civil society and have this conversation and be really straight up when I talk to people still at the companies and kind of speak the language that they speak and wear the hats that I've worn in the past in these conversations and say, I know you guys care about these issues. You are the policy teams, you are the trust and safety teams, you are working tirelessly. But at the end of the day, these incentives just get deprioritized by things like growing and keeping users on the services and keeping the lights on. And without that external pressure, we'll continue to see a failure to self-regulate. It's why 2016 kind of played out the way it did. It's why a lot of crises have occurred and have implicated the platforms in really severe ways that have led to loss of life, that have led to violence, electoral issues. And so I think we're at an inflection point as a society with this industry where it's really incumbent on all of us in this room and in DC and at the States and around the world, honestly. We see the EU doing this to really figure out how to wrap our arms around it and effectively regulate.
When you were there, I'm curious, now that you've made it to civil society, welcome.
Thank you.
How, a lot of tech-focused organizations are always trying to make recommendations about what we think the companies should do. Did you find that was making an impact? Were people considering that within the companies?
Yes, there are really well-intentioned teams internally that spend all day talking to organizations like BPC and CAP and CDT and so many others. And when I got to CAP, one of the first things I did was write one of those reports, which is like, here's how you protect elections. 3 billion people are voting next year, and this came out last year in August. And I wrote it in the way and in the style of recommendations that I would write internally. Whether or not it has had any impact kind of remains to be seen, but I do know that, after meetings with external organizations, there are well-intentioned people who share that feedback and who bring those recommendations to the people designing the systems and building the products. And ultimately, it's exactly what I said, which is that it's a for-profit institution that's going to do what continues to generate them profits. And if it's not the things on that list, they're not going to prioritize those things.
One thing the content moderation already a difficult problem. Political content moderation can get you in a lot of trouble. Even if you do it perfectly, 99.999%, of the time you get a few examples and people make a big deal out of it, and it gets you hauled in front of Congress. And so I think there are strong incentives to get it right. It's just a very difficult problem. And getting it right looks very different depending on where you sit politically. And so I think that is all the recommendations in the world don't make that problem easier. Now, around performing correctly around elections, one would hope there would be bipartisan agreement around what running a good election looks like. I'm not even sure that's 100% true. So I do think it's challenging. One thing I will point out is that we're not talking about AI or the generative AI companies here. We're talking about the social media companies. Self-regulation in the generative AI space is something different. And in fact, you can think of the reinforcement through human feedback as essentially a form of self-regulation. And so a lot of work is going into that space. Now, how are they doing it for election-related material? It's not clear. I think they're trying very hard to tell people, like, hey, these are imagination machines, they're not fact delivery machines, but then they have marketing that says something different. So I do think it's a complicated problem for them to solve. Again, I do think the real problem is in distribution, not in the content generation. So maybe that's the right place to talk about self-regulation in this space. But I did want to point out that we're not really talking about self-regulation of AI.
Yeah, so I want to do two things here. I want to come back in just a moment to self-regulation on the first mile side, on the generation side. I want to stick to distribution just for a minute. They're obviously sort of interwoven because the distribution is a complement to the. So content moderation is really hard. I think hard to do right. Nobody agrees what's right because politics is zero sum, and the thing that's good for one team is bad for the other. And so I guess I tend to agree that content moderation always leads to the political morass because you're always pleasing every piece of content you take off a platform. You're pleasing one side and making the other side mad. The other thing we've seen, if you compare today to 2016, let's say, or even 2020. And here again, I think Twitter is really the outlier, is if you look at Facebook, Instagram, whatever meta companies, you look at TikTok, just a massive turning down of the volume on political content, right? So algorithmic amplification of political content has been turned way down. We're just seeing less politics on those platforms than we did half a decade ago, a decade ago. Is that and I can see trade-offs there. I'm just interested in your thoughts. To the good, to the bad, is that there's a kind of self-regulation that they've, to some extent, taken, not completely, obviously, but to some extent, taken themselves out of the politics business. Is that on balance to the good?
And I'll add one, which is that a bunch of the platforms have basically said we're not going to run political ads, which is directly cutting into their pocketbook. I mean, it's not a big part of their pocketbook, but it's still a lot of money. It's just not a lot of money to them. But that's not a good solution, right? Like, for the same reasons that you were saying, which is that these targeted ads are the way that startup incumbent or people who are challenging incumbents can get traction and build a campaign. If you remove that factor, I think that's bad for democracy. So I don't think that's a great solution. Although you can see the appeal of it, which is it's easy. They don't have to make any of these decisions anymore. They just say, hey, we don't do that sort of thing here anymore. And it's a form of self-regulation, but I think it's a pretty bad one.
In 2017 to like 2020, the pendulum was kind of swung on the post-2016 side of things. And now, and again, Twitter is the outlier. They didn't do political ads last time and are doing political ads this time, and everyone's kind of doing the inverse now. But the pendulum has now swung to the Texas and Florida cases and Missouri v. Murthy, and the relationship between technology companies and governments and the public is at an all-time sort of inflection point to where the problem of scale is so severe, and the realization that they cannot effectively moderate political speech and political advertisements in a way that, forget keeping everyone happy because it's zero sum, we know that's not possible, but even just keeping the space healthy is completely impossible. And so the solution is to downrank political content. And even downranking political content with social issue classifiers and machine learning models that are trained on every social issue that exists is quite imperfect when you think about the scale at which they're operating on all the content. So even though that's the solution they've or the approach they've taken, you will still see virality around certain kinds of content that slips through the cracks, false positives, false negatives, true negatives, et cetera, that will still become issues for the companies. And so it's one approach, not necessarily the one I agree with as far as being the place for social discourse and resilient, healthy democracy, but that's what they've chosen to do.
I do think, I'm just looking back at my previous testimony, so at least as of the date of this is true. I think it's still true. Some of the platforms are requiring, if you do ads that have synthetic content in them, that you disclose it. And I don't know how they can police that effectively, but if anybody can, they could. And so that is another approach that I think some of them are taking, which just says, you have to, and their definitions around synthetic content, I think, actually are much tighter than some of the legislative language around what is AI.
They were aware earlier that red eye reduction was done with AI, and therefore
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
that was
They didn't want to ban all photos on Instagram. That would have been a problem.
So let's think about the self-regulation on the AI company side, which of course some of the AI companies are also social media companies, but some of them aren't yet, at least. So OpenAI has kind of taken a stand of you can't use their tools for political content, and other companies have been less strict about that. And of course, there's a bunch of very powerful open source models that you can put on your laptop, and then you don't have to follow their rules at all. Is that kind of content generation side, first mile self-regulation doing anything, or is the genie out of the bottle, and there's just nothing that can be done at this point, that the tools are too accessible and too powerful?
I mean, I do think that the most effective self-regulation in that space is the training of the model, and the layers that they put above it to check. Like, especially it doesn't work so well if you're downloading it to your laptop, but if you're interacting with ChatGPT or Claude or something like that, there's layers of sort of syntactic checks to see if the result that's coming out has something to do that might be a little squeamish. And that doesn't always go right either, because it's a sort of form of content moderation, and sometimes that blows up into a PR problem for them. But that is the approach. There's also been sort of collaboration across, collaboration might not be the right word, but agreements, some of them driven by the White House, some of them driven by the UK, around uses and procedures that they might adopt to help ward off the worst uses. I think the practical effects of those it's too early to know, and I think it's also hard to police some of this. The center that I have very little fear of somebody using something like ChatGPT to just crank out tons and tons of spam lies in email, because they can see everything that you're asking it, and they are watching. And so I worry less about that, but these are powerful tools, and people are going to do some crazy things with them. But again, I still think that the problem is on the distribution side, not the content creation side.
The platforms and the not platform AI companies a few months ago did sign the Munich Accords, which was kind of an effort to, as a group, self-regulate and try to prevent. Try their best to prevent deceptive content from being distributed or generated with their tools. I think that's a good first step. I think it remains to be seen how effective that's going to be. I'd like to see the companies partner more with civil society and also with academic researchers to give a little bit more transparency into what's going on in their platforms, what kind of things people are generating on those generative AI tools. This is something that tech civil society groups have been talking about for a long time, asking the companies to be more transparent about the kinds of conversations that go on their platforms. When they try to make interventions to make make the environment less toxic, what is the effect of those interventions? How well are they working? I think people have long suspected that the companies know a decent amount about that, but aren't always letting everybody else in to see how their policies are actually working. So I think more transparency would be really great to see.
I think where things like the Munich Accord or the White House commitments that the 7 generative AI developers signed as well fall really short is actually in third-party uses. So, Neil's correct. When you interact with ChatGPT, they layer all kinds of like keyword detection and trust and safety mitigations and responses that say, sorry, we're not going to tell you where to vote, but like here's an election authority in your state, and all of that stuff, right? There is this huge component to their growth and their bottom line that is API and accessing the API. And this goes for ChatGPT and Claude and Anthropic's model and Google's Bard, and all of them have this. And that's really where it's the companies, the developers, making pretty vague recommendations of the third parties that are integrating the app. So an example is that in order to integrate GPT-4 into your sort of third-party application, whatever it is, in the terms of service of OpenAI, you have to disclose that you're using GPT technology, and virtually no one does that. Because why would they? There's no regulatory hand forcing them. There is no OpenAI check that they're doing it. There is a vague, tiny line in terms of service, right? That's a transparency and accountability issue right there. And you can think about that in mass in all of the places that OpenAI's technology is being deployed. So there's a lot of gaps there that you have some training of the model, yes, but it's very easy to undo with sort of medium sophistication. And a lot of the trust and safety stuff that they build on top is completely optional. You can flip a switch on or off when you have your OpenAI developer tools available to you. And so as we think about the growth and development and the fact that Microsoft is already in all of our pockets, and then they're going to switch on Copilot and millions of people will suddenly have it without that upscale time that social media has had historically, it is incumbent on all of those developers to also have the appropriate tools for their first party and also their third party.
I'm going to open it up to questions in just a second. I want to ask you one more question, which is, so we've talked about the tech companies, we've talked about, to some extent, civil society, we've talked about regulators and government. I'm interested in the role of journalists and in the coming election and how we should be thinking about journalism. I have kind of a pet theory that at some point the information environment becomes bad enough that people have to turn back to something like authoritative sources or professionals who are willing to sign their names to things because they just know they can't believe anything that they see without somebody telling them that it's trustworthy, even if we're pretty polarized on who's trustworthy and who's not. We're at least maybe willing to turn to somebody who's accountable. But I'm interested just sort of broadly, what are the roles and opportunities that I guess our first big AI election presents for professional journalists? How should they be preparing themselves? What's their key function here?
So I think this is really important because there is the risk that if this stuff is not covered correctly, that people point to AI as a reason to be more skeptical of the outcomes of our electoral process. So I think a lot of it comes down to putting in context, understanding the technology with at least a little bit level of sophistication. Not talking about things like the AI or not lumping all of it together. Definitely don't use a Terminator analogy or other types of sci-fi movie analogies. These things are hyped up autocomplete. They're not robots yet. And so I think there's just some basic things around that. But I think also just thinking about like, how are we going to talk about this particular incident? So like my organization has been tracking essentially media coverage around the incident since the beginning of January, and we've identified 4 that got a lot of coverage. There's the Biden deepfake that you talked about. There's the Taylor Swift holding the Trump won card. There's 2 others that I'm not thinking of right off the AI generated images of Donald Trump with black voters, and the DeSantis campaign ad that had some variations of Trump hugging Fauci or something like that. So all of those got a ton of coverage, especially the Biden deepfake one, with not a lot of digging into, like, did it actually affect voters? Like, how many people the early versions of that deepfake one in particular didn't even investigate like how many people actually got these calls. The Secretary of State did investigate that, and a bunch of people got them. Did it change anybody's votes? I think those things really matter. Like digging in not just to the first headline about this thing happened and it's scary, wow, how bad could this be? But also spending the time to like get the facts right and talk about like what's the actual effect on the election or the electoral process. I think that's really important.
So much of the conversation around solutions is one, that there's no silver bullet, and I think everyone in this room generally agrees, but also around education and authoritative sources. Like those keep coming up as two areas. And so these journalists are, in many cases, the authoritative sources. And so ensuring that we're supporting them, uplifting them, appropriately giving them the space to investigate that they need, not attacking them online, and letting them really do their jobs effectively in an ecosystem that is really, really tough to navigate kind of truth from the murkiness of everything going on in this sort of elections and general information ecosystem. And I would absolutely agree with Neil, which is like, it's really important not to just kind of hook yourself or hook a story on the headline or the sort of the first 24 hours of something, but really do that deeper investigation and making sure that, the organization, the person, whoever it is doing the reporting is really aware of all the facts and then is appropriately translating that into what the people are seeing in a really timely manner, because it's going to be down to days and hours in the lead up to the election.
So we've been hosting a series of tabletop exercises with election officials to try to simulate some of these kinds of AI-generated disinformation scenarios, a variety of different kinds of scenarios, and try to figure out how to handle it throughout the day. What's the best response? And journalists keep coming up in those conversations because journalists play obviously an absolutely essential role, right? When something gets out about something that may or may not have happened in an election office, the election official needs to have a relationship with their local journalists and be able to put out a statement and things like that. So I think if we're worrying about disinformation about the election process itself, I think it's really important for journalists to try to understand the intricacies of how elections are actually carried out in the jurisdiction that they cover, form relationships with the chief local election official to be able to have that relationship ahead of time and be able to respond quickly when something happens. So that's what I would like to see journalists do, and I think journalists have actually gotten really good at this stuff since 2020, which of course so much disinformation was about the nuances of electoral process. So that's what I'd like to see them double down on this year.
Great. I think we have some microphones, and if there's folks around. Oh, and if you when you're asking a question, please stand up.
Hello. Megan Gray of Gray Matters. Neil, I appreciate your comments. I expect that in terms of actual impact on the election, where we'll see that is in news stories as opposed to a fake Biden in a puffer coat. So we'll see last minute a supposed news report about inflation spike, for example, or a race riot. I do have a question for the group, which is for the down ballot candidates or for citizens who are voting in the election, if they see something that they suspect is disinformation or AI generated that is leaving an inappropriate conclusion or impression, how do they report it? The only vehicles I'm aware of is just the standard portals at Facebook and Twitter that go into all sorts of complaints. There's not a fast track reporting system for political candidates or citizens to stop the virality of this type of phenomenon. But y'all would know better than I would, so I'm interested in your thoughts or leads.
Well, there are the reporting buttons that are built into all the platforms, and there's been a lot of arguments about whether those are effective or whether those tips go into a black hole or not. But there are also some civil society efforts to kind of monitor the information environment for disinformation. The one I'm thinking of is Common Cause maintains I think it's called the Stopping Cyber Suppression Program, and they have kind of a tip line, and they try to investigate and flag these sorts of things as well. And they also have relationships with some of the companies, or at least they did in 2020.
Yeah, I can't speak to it now, obviously, because just 'cause I'm not there, but there was a pretty robust trusted flagger program, and there was a kind of effort to onboard election authorities in each state to that program to quickly expedite information to the companies that sort of gets prioritized and looked at in a really sort of quick way to ensure that if it's election related, if it's related to a political candidate, if it's potential myths or disinformation, it gets sort of the eyes of an employee sooner than something like that I might report at scale.
So I know we've kicked Twitter a good amount, but community notes on Twitter is actually pretty productive. I think it harnesses what Tocqueville, we were talking a little bit about what Tocqueville said was the Americans' unique disdain for authority, that we don't really trust. We don't really trust people just because they have a title or because they have a position. In America, you got to prove it, and I think the platforms, to the extent that they are decentralizing some of that and taking advantage of the fact that these are very contentious issues, and there are people who will point out and argue about facts. If you give them a sort of lane that can help amplify that, I think that can be helpful. It's not a total solution, but I think it's better than sending a report into a black hole and seeing whether or not the people at Facebook pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Also, great to see you, Megan. Former FTCR.
Hi, Soren Dayton from the Niskanen Center. The Indian election has started. The European elections are in 6 weeks. Has there been anything? I think the only actual policy we've heard sounds like a third baked, bad idea in Michigan. What have people done before those elections? Granted, these are places that don't have a First Amendment, and in many cases, in India is actively suppressing free speech. But what are they doing about this, if anything?
So I am not. There's so much going on internationally; it's hard to track, and so I don't have great insights into what India is doing. I have a little bit of knowledge about what the EU is doing generally around AI. But AI and elections, I don't know. And I think, to your point, their entire regime around election speech is totally different than the U.S.'s. And so I don't even want to venture there. I think it's probably worse than ours, but I would say that. Me too.
Few things. So the Indian technology regulator is extremely strong. For the U.S., not having one, they are the diametrical opposition, and so the question, what they are doing is they are taking a very different approach to locally illegal content and moderating content and applying pressure to the platforms to take down certain types of speech or geo-block it out of Indian IP addresses, etc. There are also one-way WhatsApp channels that are sort of vehicles for the BJP and other campaigns in India and other political groups in India to disseminate information. And that's a really kind of uniquely rest of world problem that we don't face in the US. And there's not a lot of solutions there coming out of the platforms to really get their hands around this problem. And so there is a whole host of other challenges and other approaches and solutions that other governments are taking. In Singapore, there's a misinformation law that requires a takedown of certain types of misinformation within a certain time frame. And that is a very sort of unique approach and probably not something that would work here in the US. And in the EU, the DSA obviously exists. It's a flagship social media regulation there. They just undertook a special project on elections to really start to build principles and policies around how platforms are setting themselves up for successful elections. With mixed results across all of the ones I just said, but there are definitely bespoke approaches happening around the world.
Yeah, definitely there have been mixed results across the world. A lot of the countries with stronger laws about misinformation, you do see those used by the regimes in power to take down speech that they don't like. And so, yeah.
Hello, Peter Biava with Meridium Infrastructure. So the fact that we're talking about potential misuse of AI for disinformation suggests that kind of the natural incentives aren't aligned with public good. So what policy tools do we have, carrot or stick? What can we use to align the incentives between the owners and users of the technology and the public good?
I mean, I think the companies, we have to make them compete to try to produce the safest product, right? I think that they do have some competition there to try to. I don't think any of the companies want to be in the news for creating the AI engine that powers some disinformation campaign, right? And I think that we just have to, the free press has to do what they do to monitor that and do good reporting on, when something comes up like this, try to understand the source of it and just try to hold the company's feet to the fire in that way.
I'll just push back on your premise a little bit. Historically, new technologies, we're much better at imagining how they could go wrong than imagining how people are going to end up using them in 5 years. And so the fact that we're talking about the fact that there's risks here, I don't think naturally implies that the interests of the providers are unaligned. I think it's just that we're much better, especially here in DC, at imagining how things could go wrong, which is part of the job of government, I think.
Yeah.
And I think there's a sobering sort of reflection, at least in the tech policy sort of niche that I exist in, of the last 20 years and looking ahead and not wanting to repeat those mistakes. And so I would agree with Neil, which is that there's a lot of like well-intentioned thought around these problems and a desire to not go down the path that we went down before, which is just like a laissez-faire.
Maybe we'll take one more question. There was a question up here in the front.
Hi, Eric Ham with the AP. You guys have been talking about the role of the media, and I'm really interested, particularly at the local level, where we know you all are talking about some potential vulnerabilities, but we've also seen at the local level where a lot of media organizations have either been gutted or we've just seen a lot of them close. And so I'm curious, what is the next step if you don't have that reporting process available and then you still have this clear vulnerability? How do you address that?
It's access community notes, right?
Well, I mean, you say that sort of jokingly. I mean, the idea of reducing the cost to produce professional-looking content does suggest that the role of citizen journalists could become much more important. Now, it still takes a lot of work, right, to get the facts that you then put in and craft into a story. Can we backfill all of that? I don't know. I don't know. It's a really tough problem. We have more access to information than we ever have. We have the potential to make that into something that actually is knowledge and information. AI might be a tool that helps us do that, but I don't think that anybody's figured out exactly how to do that well yet. The media business models they have been relatively slow to adapt even to the internet, and so I think we're going to see even more shuffling under AI, and I don't know what that looks like. Hopefully, it can drive some of the solutions to these local problems, but I don't see a path yet that's obvious.
Yeah, and the report that I mentioned earlier that we did on where voters go to get their information, like local journalism was really important. And yeah, I wish we had better ideas on how to make the economics of local journalism work, because it's essential.
That will have to be the next panel. Will be
Yeah.
the business model for local journalism in the age of AI. Please join me in thanking our panelists for very